I am going to go through and review and revisit the work that you've done this week with Antarctica, the Antarctica text, A Desert of Ice and Antarctica's Life, and those questions that you answered that go along with the text. We're also going to talk briefly about that discussion post that you did yesterday, and then introduce the text that you'll be reading today about Easter Island. So, first let's get started and talk about these questions that you answered on Tuesday. You read two texts that are both on a similar topic. The first one, Mrs. Body kind of went through and read with you, and that was titled A Desert of Ice. And I remember reading this passage and thinking that it really talks a lot about Antarctica's climate. I know that they mentioned no humans live there. Really, the only animals they mentioned in this text were the emperor penguin, and they talked a lot about this extreme climate, the coldest, driest, windiest place on earth is how they described it in paragraph 1. They talked about that really thick sheet of ice that covers the continent in paragraph 2. And then in paragraph 3, they talk about the months and how, even during the warmest month in January, the temperature is still below 0 degrees. And they talked about the sunlight and how it's continuously shining bright from, I think it was mid-September all the way to mid-March. And then during the other half of the year, it's just very dark, and that's their cold winter months. They also talked about why it's classified as a desert, because the precipitation is so low, right? It actually receives less rainfall than the Sahara Desert. And in the last paragraph, they mention how they have these colossal blizzards and winds can even reach up to 200 miles per hour. So if we think about it, in paragraph 1, they said it's the coldest, driest, and windiest place. And then if you look here in paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, and 5, doesn't it really talk about why it's right here the coldest in paragraphs 2 and 3, the driest in paragraph 4, and then in paragraph 5, the windiest? So really it kind of gave you the main idea of this article and then gave you those key details to support. Then you guys went on and you read Antarctica's Life on your own. And in this passage, you learned also about the climate, but a little bit more about some of the animals that live in Antarctica. You learned that most animals do not live on land because it's just too cold and dry and windy. But there are some, right? The emperor penguin, there's even, it's kind of odd, but some insects like the midge and some really small teeny tiny ticks. There's also some seabirds, and we learned that the other animals that we're kind of more familiar with when we think of Antarctica actually live out in the ocean. So you guys had some questions to answer in response to these two texts. So let's now look over here at this screen at some of these questions. In the first question, you had to highlight some text, right? So we're kind of getting used to these now. We hover over and it highlights a portion of the text. But in this one, we had to highlight 2 sentences from each text selection. So on my screen here, you can see a paragraph from A Desert of Ice and a paragraph from Antarctica's Life. But let's see what it is that we're looking for. So it says here, Antarctica has an extreme climate. Extreme meaning harsh or severe, right? It's that coldest, windiest, driest idea. So we have to highlight 2 sentences from each text that support that idea. So in all, we're going to highlight a total of 4 sentences. When we look at the first text selection here, we just take this sentence by sentence and think, does this sentence support that idea of the extreme climate? So the first one reads, of the 7 continents, Antarctica is most unlike the other 6. Doesn't really mention climate here. This landmass is about 1.5 times the size of the United States, but there are no permanent human residents there. Now, you might make an inference after you've read the text that because of the cold climate, there are no human residents. But in this sentence, they really don't mention the extreme climate. Let's continue reading. This is due to the continent's inhospitable climate. Well, now I'm kind of thinking that because they mention the word climate, and I know that inhospitable means that it's not very welcoming, so this does reference the extreme climate. I'm going to click this sentence. Let's read the last one. Home of the South Pole, Antarctica is the coldest, driest, windiest place on Earth. That absolutely mentions the climate. Let's go on to the second paragraph. These creatures include penguins, other seabirds, seals, and whales. Doesn't mention climate. Most share a trait that allows them to handle the sub-zero temperatures. That idea of sub-zero temperatures, that refers to extreme climate. Their bodies have special feathers or thick layers of blubber or fat that insulates them. And again, we might infer that that has to do with the extreme climate. However, it doesn't really mention that. Let's see if there's a better choice. Even so, many come ashore just to bear their young, meaning to give birth. That doesn't mention the extreme climate. Only the seas provide these creatures with enough food and shelter to survive. Now, this second part of the sentence, the shelter, that only in the ocean or the seas can they have shelter to survive. Why? Because it is so extreme on land. Let's look at the next question. Which statement about Antarctica is best supported by both passages? Well, I know that many of you said, well, in paragraph 1, I read about it being the coldest, driest, windiest place on Earth. And then in paragraph 1 of this text, I also read the continent is colder, drier, and windier than any place on our planet. So when I look at those answer choices, the best answer choice is going to be B. Let's go on to the last question. In this question, we had to think about our answer to the previous question. Well, if we go back, that's that idea of the coldest and driest continent on Earth. Which two paragraphs, one from each article, best support your response? Well, we actually just said that. Look, paragraph 1 in A Desert of Ice mentions that idea of the coldest, windiest, and driest. And so I'm going to check paragraph 1 of Desert of Ice. And then when I look at Antarctica's life, it has an extremely harsh climate. The continent is colder, drier, and windier. So this is also paragraph 1. So those are the 3 questions that you responded to. If you have any other questions or concerns about that assignment, please let me know. In part 2, we're going to talk briefly about that discussion post from yesterday. Discussion post that you completed yesterday, and then I also have the text over here on the side to reference. So yesterday you were to describe basically life in Antarctica and how animals survive in Antarctica. And you have to include 2 details from each text to support your response. As I was reading through some of the responses, a lot of you have your own ideas, but some of you did not include 2 details from each text to really support your response. So it's really important, boys and girls, that when you are asked to include some what we call text evidence, that you're actually taking the time to go back in the article and find some of the words that the author used to support your thinking. So I gave you that hint that you might include information about the climate from the first article and then information about how animals survive in the second article. So now I'm going to go back over here to the first article. Well, if I'm looking for information about climate, right here I again learn that really the main idea stated that it's the coldest, driest, windiest place on Earth. I could include details like there are no human residents here. I might tell my reader that Antarctica is really a thick sheet of ice, or there's actually a thick sheet of ice that completely covers Antarctica. I might include that detail that, even during the warmest month, right? You think about that here in Florida, we're like over 100 degrees. Well, over in Antarctica, it's still below 0 during their warmest month. How the sun is shining really continuously from mid-September to mid-March, but then disappears for the other half of the year. I might even mention the idea that the Sahara Desert receives more rainfall than in Antarctica. Now, I could also mention this idea of colossal blizzards and winds that reach up to 200 miles per hour. All of these details support that idea of that extreme climate and also what it would be like to live in Antarctica. Really, I think for animals and how they survive in Antarctica, we're talking about source 2. So now if I switch over to Antarctica's life, this is really where they mention more of like the animal and plant life, right? As a result, far fewer plants and animals live there than on the other 6 continents. So we know that they're going to talk more about animals here. So I know, again, they mentioned the emperor penguin. They mentioned some of those land animals here in paragraph 2. And then they also mention here in paragraph 3, it says, although they do not live on land all year, several marine animals make their homes in Antarctica. So then they mention some of those animals that live in the ocean. Now, let's take a look. I worked with a small group and we did this post together. So just to give you guys an idea of the expectation when you're doing a written response or a discussion post, take a look at this one that we did together. We started off with a hook, just like you would in writing. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to live in Antarctica? Imagine the coldest, driest, and windiest place on Earth. Winds can reach up to 200 miles per hour. It is the driest continent because there is less than 2 inches of moisture each year and it is usually snow. The Sahara receives more rainfall each year than Antarctica. Life in Antarctica is also very cold with temperatures that never reach warmer than 0 degrees. So that first part of that entire written response answers that first question, describing life in Antarctica. So now we go on to talk about how the animals survive. The animals in Antarctica can survive this extreme climate because they have thick layers of blubber, which is fat, or special feathers to help them survive. Some of the animals that can live in Antarctica are whales, seals, emperor penguins, and other seabirds. Other than the marine animals that live in Antarctica, there are insects, including ticks, the midge, and other microbes. So again, boys and girls, it's really important that when you are asked to include text evidence, that you go back into the article. You can write this in your own words, or what we call in writing paraphrasing, but you still need to include some of those details. All right, in the last part of this video, I'm just going to briefly introduce you to the article that you'll be reading today. Maybe like a post-it note or a sheet of paper, but just something to jot down an idea. So if you don't have those materials, please pause the video and go get them now. So before we begin reading today, there are 2 texts that you're going to read, and they are about Easter Island. So I'm just going to scroll through really quick. This is the first one, A Short History of Easter Island, and just let you take a look. Notice some of the nonfiction text features that the author has included. Looks like there are mostly photographs. There are some words to know. The second article is titled Easter Island's Decline. When we say the word decline, typically we're talking about like their population declining, and that means that their population is decreasing or getting smaller. So before you read these articles, why did you get the post-it note? Well, I want you to write down what you already know about this topic of Easter Island. Do you know anything about the topic? Have you ever heard of Easter Island? Do these photographs look familiar? So take about 30 seconds and jot down anything that you know. If you don't know anything about Easter Island and none of this looks familiar, then just write down, I do not know anything about this topic. Give me just another moment to write down your ideas. Okay, so now that we've had just a moment to kind of what we call activate our background knowledge or our prior knowledge, meaning thinking about what we already know, I know personally I didn't really know much about Easter Island other than that I've seen these statues before, like in photographs or maybe in a movie, I'm not sure. But I know that these look familiar to me, but I'm not really sure why it's called Easter Island. I didn't really know where it was located, just that I have seen these statues before. That's really my only background knowledge of this topic. So today what we're going to do is read through this article, and you have that graphic organizer available to you if you would like to use it as you're reading through both texts. After that, you do have some multiple choice questions that you're going to respond to,